Okay, well, Usman, welcome to the Girl Summit. Very, very excited to have you today with us. Usman, I'm not a big fan of very long introductions, but Usman is a fellow writer, he's a friend, he's an ally. He is the author of the novel Blasphemy, The Trial of Danesh Masi, which was published last year in 2020. That's just one of the many things Usman does. He was selected as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in 2017. He graduated with an MBA and an MA in International Relations from Yale University. But above all, Usman is definitely someone whose work and outlook really mirrors the soul of this conference. And so, I'm very excited to have you here today, Usman. And there's been a lot of talk about gender inclusive spaces and things like that. And I have to say, it's not always the norm to have all genders as part of a discussion like this or sessions like this. And so I'm just so pleased that we're not suddenly turning this into, an all women or a male bashing kind of space. So welcome and very, very happy to have you.
Thanks for having me, Saba, and thanks for that lovely introduction. I hope I'll be able to do it justice. But yeah, very excited to be here to support this sort of conference.
100% you are going to, and we know that, which is why you're here. Usman, I just want to jump right in because there's so much that I'm looking forward to chatting about. I'm going to start out before we really get into the heart of, the Girl Summit. I'm going to start out by throwing at you a word that often throws me off, or let's just say, which I've taken my time trying to unpack and process, which is feminism. And the fact that it's become something that's deeply politicized and, it feels like a bit of a loaded term when we hear it today. There's also a connotation, especially in the global South, of how you have to be a woman or a girl to be a feminist. So let's just start by asking you what this term means to you and whether you identify as a feminist, and if so, what does that encapsulate for you?
Yeah, no. I mean, I 100% identify as a feminist. So just off the bat, there's no controversy there. But I think it's also, it doesn't have the sort of mixed connotations for men as it does for women as well. So I recognize even in my ability to say that I am a feminist or proudly announce that it's easier for me. And there's an irony in there that, one can unpack later. But for me, it just means, equal rights and opportunities for men and women and sort of, I guess more broadly, even other sort of genders. And I think that's something that should not be controversial or problematic or difficult for anyone. I think what it has, because the way power structures exist today, men, in especially a lot of the areas which I guess this Girl Summit is sort of focused on, Middle East and South Asia. They're very patriarchal systems. Men generally control a lot of the power. And so there is an element of trying to shame or vilify those who are asking for equality because it's a threat to one's power. And I think that's why, there's an attempt to make feminism a dirty word. But if it is a dirty word, then it's a dirty word that I'm very proud to own. But I do recognize that it's much harder for women to own this word because oftentimes it's associated with the other terms that are often used to vilify women, bossy or what. Those words are all sort of linked up in this idea where it's just women asking for an equal share, an equal opportunity, and there's a sense, I think, of how it threatens the existing power structure and people in it. I'm not sure that was the full answer to your question or not, but that's where I land on the word feminism.
Well, I love the fact, Usman, not that it was a trick question, but I love the fact that you have clarity, because a lot of times people will be very much on the fence, especially men, and precisely for the reasons that you've outlined, which is that there's a nervousness. Sometimes there's also just, I suppose, a misunderstanding around it. But I have to also say, I love this idea of dirt that you brought up, and maybe we'll come back to it. But even at NYU, a lot of times when we're talking to students, this comes up a lot when you speak about women's issues, or you speak about the gender movement, and this idea that you're owning the dirt, and kind of, yes, we're dirty and that's how it is. And it's just so lovely that you said if it is something associated with that, then you're happy to own it. And it really puts a very important spin on the connotations attached to it. So thank you for saying that. No, that was beautiful. Usman, I'm going to really get into the complications. No conversation around a girls' summit can be linear or straightforward. And I think it's so important to actually really embrace the fact that this is a complex domain. When I think about, of course, today we're talking about the girl child and gender equality across the world, but I would like to kind of pivot it around South Asia for a little while, if that's okay with you. And with that said, the conversation in places like Pakistan, like India, when it comes to feminism, is getting dangerously polarized, as you've also said right now. And there seems to be this real sense of, you've got to bash men in order to be compelling and in order to be an authentic, real feminist. And I feel like, social media then becomes a bit of a double-edged sword, because a lot of times with these virtual smoke screens, you're seeing people really kind of making it quite alienating. And that's something that I think a lot of boys and men feed back with as well. So, I mean, talk to us a little bit about how or whether you think the movement is painting all men with the same brush, or to a large extent is kind of, there's this blanket dismissal. And with that, I think we're like throwing the baby out with the bathwater. And what I mean is that even if men are trying to sort of make inroads, or trying to support, trying to carve out spaces for allyship, that's getting dismissed in all of the surround sound. My fear with that, Usman, becomes that, are we really just replacing one power vortex with another then? Or is that there? I know we're not quite there yet, but is that the danger we're kind of putting ourselves in? And if so, how does the conversation move from like us and them, men and women, versus women, rather, I should say, do things like allyship and do things like coalition, which are so close to your and my heart?
Yeah, to some extent, Saba, I feel like I have a sense of where you are on this topic by the fact that you asked the question.
Yeah.
And the way you asked the question. I honestly don't think that the men bashing is an issue at all. Like, right. I know that's not what, I don't think that's where you're coming from, but or where your position is. Yeah. But actually, I feel that, it sounds a bit like there's a letter from, I think, the Birmingham jailer that Martin Luther King is supposed to have written to these people in the sort of clergy and things who were not who were ostensibly supporting him, but what he called white moderates. I believe it was directed to them. Maybe it's if we could fact check later, if we had some system, it'd be great. But essentially, he uses the term white moderates, and he says the real danger isn't from the sort of extremist racists who are, dressed in Ku Klux Klan outfits and things like that. That's not what's really holding the movement, the civil rights movement, back. It's what he calls white moderates, people who are ostensibly supporting the movement, but always like, hey, don't march so much, don't be such a nuisance, don't be so difficult or problematic, just, you're alienating people. Again, the same sense that like, your movement is not going to be effective because you're alienating people and you're not going to get our support, and it makes us feel uncomfortable and things. And that's and so when I hear people complaining about not all men and things like that, I'm like, how can you miss the point? Who is saying that this is just about you. I mean, how can you live in a society, in a country in South Asia, or I mean, maybe I shouldn't say all countries because I don't, but I mean, how can you live in some of these countries and really sort of, have an issue with people saying this, because they're not, because the structure and the system is designed in such a way that it does sort of discriminate. It does, make women feel unsafe. I mean, there's every week, every day, you read about something sort of absurd and terrifying, and that really viscerally affects you, and you think, okay, it can't get any worse. And the next day, something else comes about. So in an environment like this, I feel those people who are often saying, oh, you're bashing men, or not all men, are just I think those people are more dangerous than the people who come out and actually march in opposition, because you know who they are. These people are actually, it's scarier. It's more problematic. And one thing I often worry also about is performative allyship. I don't know, it's and it's one of the reasons, like, I'm often like, I often feel there's a bit of like concern for me whenever I am posting or pushing, like how can I actually, how is it actually moving the needle versus is this just something for the gram or whatever? But I feel like they're all kind of into, like, I don't want to get into that so much, but I'm saying, it's, if you are genuine, or if you genuinely see the problem in front of you, then you would not be looking at not all men, or bringing up things about, why is there men bashing? You'd be thinking there's not enough happening, right? Because because if you really look at sort of the issues and the stats, and just, read the paper, you would get a sense of extreme discomfort. So my view is potentially there might be space, but I honestly don't think there's enough happening. And I think that the danger with this movement is actually you're not able to bring on, or there are people who are able to live in this space where they don't have to address or engage with the subject, because they can blame it on, again, the movement rather than themselves or the system they're in. And so that's why, that's why I'm not sort of that's why I think it's fine for all the man bashing that takes place, because I don't think it's bashing a system that exists, and if you open your eyes, you'll see it exists.
Yeah, well, Usman, I have to say, as I listened to you, and you're right, because I was coming from a slightly, you're aware of this, we've spoken about these things in the past. I was just going to say, Usman, I'm actually really grateful. And just listening to you about this, I feel, because I was listening to you with absolute openness, even though I feel like absolutely, as I asked the question, I was coming from a slightly different vantage point. And often when you put the question, you hope for, you're looking for, oh yes, of course, there's male bashing. But on a serious note, I'm actually just, it really helps me to try and look at this from a lens or a gaze that I actually perhaps have, I don't want to say neglected, but maybe just have not had as much focus on. And when I hear someone like you bring up a subject like this, and it is, the point is not that that anger is wrong or there's anything that, I think anger and rage is actually important, but it does also help to be able to hear this in a state where someone's not foaming at the mouth necessarily, and it is a cool, composed conversation. Because what that does for me is it just allows me to think, and what you said about Martin Luther King, was it that the letter that you were quoting? As I was listening to that, it made me realize that there is absolutely alienation kind of happening with I mean, kind of in a different direction now. So I guess I'm just really grateful, and there's a lot for me to process there. But because I approach this whole conversation, I'd like to imagine with deep openness and, almost like a willingness to really want to unlearn. I'm very happy and excited that you've brought up a dimension that maybe I wasn't focusing on. And that was kind of the whole purpose of, doing this kind of conversation, as opposed to, well, this is just how Osman and I agree on everything. So this is really rewarding, actually. Thank you.
No, I'm glad. But I mean, I also am happy to hear, I think you put a stake in terms of your position on it a little bit in the question. Yes. But maybe, I mean, you want to come back with sort of more of that position, or how you see the movement as being potentially problematic. I mean, I'd be happy to hear that as well.
Yeah, no, thanks for saying that, Osman, because I feel like, as we were talking about earlier as well, it's all good to sit and theorize about, the ideal state of the world and feminism should be like this. But I think a conversation like this in action, and the fact that, forget like the specifics of what we're even saying, but just the fact that, and for me, this is quite a jig dance, Osman, because you're very aware of kind of my standpoint as it is on this. And I think the fact that we're able to kind of at least say, hang on a minute, actually, that's true. And I'm not saying suddenly my whole perspective on this changes, but a deep part of the problem, you'll probably agree with any such politicized issue, is the fact that people will just almost egotistically want to say, of course not, Osman, of course this is like, and vice versa. So I'm really glad that we're able to not to turn this into a mutual admiration thing, but I'm just glad that we're able to keep open, because there is a tendency, we write and work and research about these things and talk about these things, and you start taking it very personally, and kind of that lens and that vantage point starts becoming very personal, and it takes a lot to start to kind of unfold it. But you've definitely put me on that journey now, so I'm grateful.
No, that's not what I meant. I meant, but I can.
No, I mean in the best of ways, really.
I appreciate that. No, I mean, I can also see your point about, I think, actually that sometimes I do feel like social media is a terrible place, just generally for any broader discussion, right? But that has nothing to do with this movement or even the response to this movement. It's just, sound bites and whatever, how many characters Twitter has. And so I can see how those things can often lead people to feel alienated or...
Yeah. And Osman, I really feel like you took those words out of my mouth, because I feel a lot of that perception, or where I was coming from, is this idea of digital smoke screens. And I think they have their place, especially in a movement today. I definitely feel they are playing their role in the needle moving. But sometimes I have to say, and Twitter in particular, I have these moments of like, I'm not sure if the toxicity is helpful in either direction. So I think we're on the same page about this.
Back to agreeing on everything. Good.
Back to agreeing, of course, consensus, status quo. Osman, you better agree with me. No, I'm just kidding. No, this was very generative, actually. I'm going to move a little bit, Osman, tangential to what we've just been talking about, and kind of almost doing a little flip on you now, because yes, on the one hand, I feel we run the danger of alienating people. But on the other hand, I also do feel that, of course, we're in a world where trauma, and like you said very rightly, experiences, vignettes, anecdotes, but also just statistics do indicate to us that there is this skewed trauma that women and girls face as the most sort of vulnerable gender, in a sense, compared to men, at least. And I was thinking about this, I was on a seminar, it's called the Gender Brown Bag, actually, at NYU. And there was this, I think if I'm not mistaken, there was a Nigerian artist who had performed a microplay, and she was coming and chatting with us, just a small, really intimate, safe space. And she said, why are we so afraid of color? especially when it comes to women and, kind of their violent pursuit of dreams. Why are we so afraid of color? And I guess where she was coming from was that we have this kind of desire, a lot of men do at least, but even women are complicit, to kind of box women and girls into this black and white. And when there's a woman who is kind of multi-hued or kind of shows different shades, she's labeled as, what I would say is a troublemaker. And we come back to that, and I'm sure you've heard that elsewhere, but you've heard me kind of use that terminology before. And I suppose in a South Asian context, that gets amplified because we're kind of, there's this skewed chasing of purity. There's this kind of, there are gatekeepers of women's bodies and honor and all of that. So, it becomes like this real control freak kind of syndrome now. And here's really the part where I'm like, I am so happy Usman is part of this summit, because I want to hear from you very much from your identity as a man now. How do we raise sons better? I know that feels like a big question, but I think that's the starting point for where a lot starts going south. But also, just on a day-to-day basis, Usman, as a man, as a guy, what are some of the practical things that men can be doing to shift this conversation and the fabric a little bit more?
Yeah, no, it's an important question. So thank you for asking this. And I love the troublemaker, sort of the use of troublemaker. In fact, that's the word earlier I was trying to think of when I was going to Bossy. I was reaching for troublemakers. And look, I really hope that, like, after I give sort of some suggestions, you also come back with things that you've seen work well, because I don't think I have I don't think any one individual has like enough expertise to really answer this question. I think we're all kind of like stumbling in the dark, hoping that we have the right answer. And even, and even myself, like, I don't want to hold myself up as like model of any sort. So I'm not sort of trying to like say this is the way to do it. It's a very nervous place for me to be in that. I don't want to play that role. But I would say, I think what's helpful is modeling behavior for kids, right? Is how parents interact with each other. How much of, the countless studies about across the world how women do a disproportionate amount of the household chores or work, or bear the burden of most household tasks, and that's only been exacerbated with the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
And so how a couple is able to model in front of their sons and daughters an equal or more equitable distribution, I think, is sort of fundamental. How you're able to demonstrate resolving conflict through discussions and expressing things through your words and actions. Not physical, but just are able to sort of show sort of conflict resolution and proper things, and also just love. I don't know. Maybe it sounds cheesy to say it, but genuine sort of affection, in a couple, I think is sort of the essence of really raising emotionally sort of stable and expressive children, and then adults. So it's not a, and you could, one can always talk about things that one should do outside the home as well, and things like that. And I think that all comes down to modeling. I know we've talked about fathers in prior sort of podcasts. I know you were very sort of close to your father, and I was very sort of attached to mine. But I do think that, I do think in many ways, because I used to always think it's because my mother is a very strong person that I sort of developed this respect for this, or respect and sort of belief in like women's ability to do anything a man could do, maybe better. But I do also think it wasn't just my mother, or my sister, or anyone else. I think it was also, my father, and the sense of equals or partnership, the partnership that was in their marriage that sort of perhaps instilled that. And on just a note, before I go into that, I think there's often a problem where people talk about, often the movement tries to appeal to men by saying, imagine if this is your sister or your mother or something like that, if this happened. But the truth is, you shouldn't have to go through that process, right? Like any human being going through this is problematic, right? And so I don't want to sort of say that, you need X or Y, but I do think in terms of the way, I think for me growing up, it's been something that is, and again, it's not perfect. I mean, everyone's a work in progress, but that has opened my doors to it, I think, is at home seeing sort of an equal partner, or seeing a big partnership between my parents. I shouldn't say, and seeing the sort of love with them, and then having them model that behavior with other people. I think that was sort of key, and perhaps very simple and very like, silly or reductive. I don't know, but it's that's what I would say is focus on the micro and the personal, and your own sort of unit, and then from there you can expand out and try to do things. I mean, there's examples at work where you sort of use social capital to help people. I think there's and also I think that there's the one thing is for an ally is stop putting the pressure on the individual, right? I think the danger of things like Lean In is actually it's saying the onus is on the person who feels like they don't have a voice, and they often don't. And all the studies actually suggest that if a woman does try to lean in, oftentimes there'll be like more negative consequences than positive, because they're often not. So just, so not to sort of, but to take the risk to use one's social capital to try and sort of give those without it an opportunity, to use one's privilege to give those who don't have a voice outside the place. But that of course does not have but I think that again, that sort of often comes from starting at home first and then going out.
Yeah.
But Saba, I think you've studied this perhaps far more extensively than I have. And so instead of asking the layman what his opinion is, maybe we could turn it around and get some of your thoughts and views.
But Osman, and I'm happy to jump in for sure. Thanks for that. But I'm so grateful that you shared that, because it's not reductive or oversimplified at all. On the contrary, I think sometimes when we anchor these things in real life anecdotes or vignettes or experiences, they resonate so much more powerfully. And yes, I'm aware we've spoken about this in the past, and that was me kind of more going on, but I realized that there's a lot of relatability there as far as our fathers go. And I think it's very important to, these are hard conversations to have, but the fact that you've brought it up is extremely, moving to hear, to be honest. So thank you for doing that. Actually, so thank you for sharing that. And I think I relate to it 100%. And you're right. This is not about this is not the Olympics of parenthood and who kind of had the best parent, but it's about saying that, yes, that modeling does begin in the house. And I agree more than 100% with everything you've said, just because, Abu's influence, very similar to the experience you've just outlined, was was indelible, both to obviously who we are today, who I am, who my sister is, but more importantly, perhaps to who my brother is as well. And so today, like, in fact, this is a laughing joke in the family where my mother's like, when we were getting married, it was like, can you stop looking for like like the replica of that? And that's not to say my partner won't have those qualities, but it's just to say you build these expectations, from a very young age going on. And so, for example, in my home, one of the things that I always saw between my parents, but then also in the way that Abu raised all of us, but somehow in Pakistan, it's a bigger thing, I think, with the girls, because it becomes more of the exception rather than the rule when a father does that. And, I always think back to this in a Unilever interview. Someone had once asked me, completely random, it was a recruitment interview. And I'm thinking, I loved that question. It was so refreshing. But he said something like, father-daughter relationship, what do you think? And just whatever you want to say. And honestly, Osman, what jumped to my mind amongst a ton of things that you and I could talk about when it comes to our fathers was, I was like, well, growing up, one of the things my father taught me was, how do you inculcate values in your kids based on a parenting and a fathering model that's based on respect rather than fear? And so, if I came home at a certain time at night, because I was a curfew, it was never an official curfew. It was just because somewhere subliminally Abu's values had passed on. And again, totally with the disclaimer that you gave, this is not some real 100% like we did no wrong, Abu did no wrong kind of thing. But I just feel, unfortunately, we don't have enough of those models in Pakistan when it comes to a father-daughter relationship. And today, I try so hard, sometimes almost to the point of patronizing my husband, to say, I just have this keenness for Yusuf to have that, really, just to have a beautiful relationship with the girls. And it was very poignant that you brought that up. And I think we don't talk enough about those vulnerable spaces. So thank you for that. And kind of accompanying that, Osman, very quickly, what I want to say, you asked me kind of where I come from on this. And, there's so many things, but one of the things that I suppose is very salient to this conversation for me is when I was pregnant with both the girls, and more so with the second, because everyone and their grandmother then was kind of like, oh, I hope she redeems this now by having a boy. And I kid you not, I'm talking about folks at NYU. I am not talking about people we like to relegate as, oh, ye to jahil hai, inko kuch nahi. These are like the illiterate people roaming the streets of Karachi. No. And I remember this one episode distinctly where I was coming out of my daughter's nursery, which was also on campus. I'd had the older one, and somebody just asked me, so, you're pregnant, do you know the gender? And I said, yeah, we're having another girl. And without an iota of exaggeration, Osman, the woman was crestfallen, like, physically her expression, but then she couldn't help but verbalize it. And she said, oh, she just said, oh, and I was just like, okay, sure. So I suppose for me, this ties into what you were talking about, to say just from the birth, and it was a very strange moment for me, because when I held my daughter, the second one, in my arms for the first time, or maybe just one of the initial days, I did go back to those women's words and just that expression to say, it just felt very tragic. And I think over time, Usman, I've moved from feeling jaded and bitter to feeling like, I'm going to celebrate this, and this is one of the most beautiful things that I will ever experience. And I can't allow somebody's words or expressions to kind of detract from that. But all of this, not to just make it about my story, people face much harsher consequences of giving birth to girls in places like Pakistan. My point is to say, I think a lot of work needs to be done right from the time you realize that a girl is going to be born, because that starts getting internalized, and eventually to what she can do, what she can't do, and almost like, please mourn and kind of condole because a girl was born. So anyway, that was so much of my story, but I feel like every time I talk to you, a chunk of my heart and my soul is in the conversation, and that's thanks to you for giving me that comfort. But I don't want to just be that hypocrite who abstracts about these and doesn't talk about her own story. And so I'm really grateful you shared yours too.
Well, thank you for sharing that. No, I think that sounds absolutely right. I mean, I guess the answer, and to sort of take from what you just said as well, it's, as you say, it's not just about it sort of one individual or one unit, but how we collectively as society can start to sort of shift shift the conversation and perception, even the response, I guess, to a girl coming to this world.
Yes. Yeah. So, Usman, I want to move on, and I want to now talk about hopefully what is one of your favorite things, and mine too, but which is also, again, this is not about you and me, as we're saying. I want to talk about art and creativity, something that is kind of your fulcrum, and even beyond your identity as a writer, just the fact that you consume all of these things, as do a lot of people in the world, which is why this is salient. And, it's something that obviously in different fashions and forms, it's something that has pushed, torn the envelope, whatever the expression might be. It's, in this attempt to shift the fabric of society. Now I am going to bring you into the conversation as a novelist, Usman, because I feel both in terms of your identity as a storyteller, but also in terms of what you consume, that's going to be important to draw upon. How can we, or how should we potentially be thinking about using literature, art, I don't know, like right from like slam graffiti to like hip hop, I don't know, the works, because I'm really looking at this as a cultural omnivore. Like, I don't want us to have this highbrow conversation on how does opera change the world, which it does, but it's one way of doing that. How do we think about literature and art, vis-a-vis something like the Girl Summit and girls' issues? And especially, Usman, how do we do it in places where a lot of these conversations still happen in whispers, where there is a price to pay, and a nervousness around exploring this terrain, and again, I go back to this amazing phrase you used with me once of verbal gymnastics, because we're often on these talks and things, and you're thinking, how much can be said? How much needs to be kind of quickly self-centered? Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, I think I have often swung in terms of my view, like the impact that literature can have. I swing regularly in terms of, but I think art more generally. I mean, I think if you look historically, it's there are certain works of art or creative work or combination of documentaries that do shift conversation, influence lawmakers, raise conversations, or highlight issues. I mean, the example I think about more recently, sort of relevant to the region, is Sharmeen Obaid's Girl in the River, right, which was then sort of aired and showed to Nawaz Sharif when he was in power, and they passed a sort of a bill to curb honor killings basically in Pakistan. Now, the fact that it's not being implemented properly, or there's still obviously this issue across the country, is a bigger issue, right, in terms of the structure and the resources and everything else we can get into. But that actually having raising a conversation, highlighting an issue, and having sort of actual sort of, I guess, some tangible change, I think is an example of how this work can have an effect. I know. I believe so. I think basically by giving a voice, and I no longer use the term a voice to the voiceless, because a friend of mine pointed out these people are often not voiceless. It's just that no one's listening or no one can hear them.
That's right. That's right.
And so but sort of giving a megaphone to people whose voices traditionally aren't heard. To sort of extend that metaphor, I think oftentimes it can raise these issues and make people take notice and change to some extent. I think there's a danger of sometimes changes just being sort of cosmetic or a way to make one feel better. So I think a lot about large tentpole action movies, and I won't name any, but oftentimes I feel that there's an attempt to put in a female character as the lead, but it's just, I mean, it's not really addressing any of the core underlying issues or problems. And in some sense, it's still hypersexualizes them in some ways, and it's still sort of targeted towards men rather than addressing, any of the underlying issues. So, so there is that danger as well, right? That it's that these can be co-opted. These movements can be co-opted, or these things can be co-opted again just to sell more tickets or sell more, whatever it is. And so, but again, at the best of times, art can elevate a conversation, can be transformative, and can really change people. And I think, there's, I don't believe that necessarily by sort of forcing yourself to read something, you aren't necessarily going to become more empathetic or something. There is some research to suggest that is the case, but I feel like I know plenty of readers who are not very nice people, so I don't want to.
I hear you. I
don't want to overstate that, but I do think that yes, it can elevate conversations. It can bring about change. At the same time, it can be co-opted, and things can be quite superficial. But it really depends on us, and sort of holding, sort of elevating those conversations well, right? As readers, as consumers, and sort of driving a lot of that change. It's not necessary. It's not sufficient on its own, but I think it's very helpful and can facilitate sort of movements and change.
Yeah, Osman, what you said about kind of the more cosmetic changes, this is something I think about so much. Just in terms of this idea, as you said, of like window dressing, and just kind of course, it's a great PR strategy. And what I mean is, again, the point is not to say, hey, all of literature or all of art is doing that, but there's often that, I think that's where intent and motivation becomes really important. And as I was listening to you, it made me realize how interesting it is to think about intersectionality, because the same thing that you're saying about the movies, I've also seen happen with race-related issues, and in books and in films, and you're thinking, oh yeah, there's just some character that no longer looks white, and he's going to be like the little marginalized friend, or like, whatever. And hopefully perhaps that is changing, but I love the fact that you've complicated that in your answer, as opposed to trying to say, oh yeah, no, like writing novels on this is the way to go. And I'm so with you. I very much kind of, I'm quite polemic on this as well. So there are moments I'm feeling like, being a novelist is my song, and I think it's different from the song thing. Like that's a separate thing. But there are definitely more skeptical moments where I'm thinking, no, the novel is pretty much extinct, and so I better keep my day job. But yeah, everything you said really, really resonates with me, and thank you for bringing that up. Now, in the interest of time, Usman, I've got a couple of other questions. I mean, you and I could keep talking to you for much longer, but I want to ask something, Osman, briefly, that is sort of, it's really tangential to what we've already spoken about, and I don't want to miss out on that, which is that, of course, literature, art, creativity, all of that in some ways is foundational and has, like you very rightly said, transformative potential, especially over time. Yet we see that there's constantly this debate on authenticity, and there's the sense of like who can speak for whom. We see it in terms of the immigrant voice. We also see it in terms of, well, Usman's a man. Should he really be talking about the issues women face? Awais Khan, our friend and fellow author, he's spoken a lot about this, like kind of pushback against men when they think of talking about honor and issues of this, that, the other. And I don't really know where I'm going to come clean and say, and I'm not doing a cop-out, but I want to really flesh this out with you, because I'm not clear where I stand on this. Or it's not even about where I stand. We're not trying to take positions here, but just there are moments where I feel like the politics of representation can feel so heavy. I feel apprehensive writing about women in Pakistan as an immigrant expat Pakistani author. And I want to talk to you specifically vis-a-vis the Girl Summit about talking about a man, even when you think about future pieces you might write, or forget the hypotheticals are mostly not that helpful. Just talk to me about this.
Yeah. So it's an interesting point. I think, I think there's like a couple of dimensions to it, right? One is, or several dimensions, but I'm going to focus on maybe two or three. One is, if someone is taking up a position that, say, or a slot that would otherwise go to a minority or a person who traditionally does not have a very good track record in publishing, right? So there's what was it, American Dirt, I think was the name of the book, where an author published a book that was supposed to be about, I believe, from a Latin American country, someone dealing with mobs and gangsters, and was trying to flee away and come to come to America, and there was all sorts of cartels and things they were dealing with, and in the marketing, I think they position themselves as very much from this place, and they even mentioned, I think their husband had a hard time immigrating or something, but it turned out that he was Irish, I believe. So there's like but there's a problem when I think so. There's an issue, I think, sometimes with that, when it's co-opting or using a story and misrepresenting one's own story.
Sure.
Sort of give it that authentic feel or flavor, right? Like and also in some, but I don't think there's necessarily, the onus isn't just on the author, right? It's on the publishers, it's on readers, it's on everyone to sort of to vote in terms of with their pocketbooks and everything else to decide. Like, I don't think it's simply done. But that's one aspect of it, right? But the other aspect is that there's shouldn't everyone be? Or the other issue I think people often have is when you read a male author write a woman, and it's so clearly a man who's writing it.
Right.
And that's often through hypersexualization of the the character, right? Like, and so I think there's, I think if it's done well, because right now I think actually publishing there, there was obviously a problem when J.K. Rowling was coming out, and she sort of had to drop the Joan, right, and went with J.K. And to some extent, there still might be some of that. But I do think representation in terms of gender in publishing isn't as bad as it was. There might be still some way to go, but there's still better representation. But that I think is a problem that really men should get readers who are like women, and, or of the others. Like any writer, any writer should get readers from the other group they're writing about, especially if they're going into their mind. Try and make it more authentic. This whole conversation can get kind of ridiculous and absurd sometimes, where there was an incident recently, in New York Times had an article about called Bad Art Friends, where one author wrote about where she was an aspiring author, and she donated her kidney, and she created like a small group of who she thought were her friends and wrote about it and explained, and she was expecting a lot of praise and stuff as a result. And she, in her defense, had struggled and come from a fairly disadvantaged background, but she was a white woman. And this other author from a minority ethnic community in the US wrote a short story about a woman who donated her kidney to an Asian woman, and used, used that story. I mean, it was a starting off point. She changed it obviously eventually, but it became more problematic. But she used a bit of the letter that person had written to her unknown donatee. This is what I would write to them, and she used some of that because she felt it was such a good source material. And now that woman who donated her kidney is now suing the other woman because
dear, oh gosh,
it can quite unravel. But the question is, I mean, no one is saying that person had to donate a kidney in order to write that story.
Yes.
Right. And the work of authors is to sort of take something real sometimes and fictionalize it or use it as a starting off point. I think for anything to feel authentic, you need to visit the places, or I mean, most characters in books are, some of them are completely fictional, but a lot of them are like bits and pieces of people you need, characteristics exaggerated and everything else. So I do believe anyone should be able to write about anything, with the caveat that if you're writing about underrepresented group, are you the right person to be telling that story? And is there some way you could work with, if you're a more established author and you're getting this thing, is there some way you could work with an author from that community to sort of elevate them? If you feel like you want to tell the story, work with someone, right? There's no reason why you can't do that. Or B, if they're not sort of necessarily that underrepresented, if it is somebody who's very different, get somebody from that community or that gender to read it, because you will probably have blind spots and you will probably not realize or recognize what you're missing. And not just one necessarily, right? Because you can have one sensitivity reader, but it's like, being the only Pakistani in a classroom asked to speak about, Pakistani foreign policy and whatever else it is, and you're defending or for a country, and you're like, well, actually, 220 million people. There's a lot of diversity in this country. Maybe just don't be the token voice. So I would say those are the caveats I would use for writing about the other and sort of making sure that you have done a good job. I mean, there's also the Bechdel test, but I don't know if we have time to go through that. But again, it's any book should ideally at least pass the Bechdel test, which is two women talking together about something other than men. Right? Like, if you'd be surprised how many movies fail to do this. Books generally tend to be longer, so they can really pass, but sometimes they just don't have two women characters in the same scene together, and it's a bit appalling sometimes when you see that. So
I love that, Usman. I wasn't aware of that, actually.
Oh, really? No.
That's wonderful. I mean, and what I really appreciate is also the fact that it's, that seems like a really good, hit this expression, but a win-win. So what I'm trying to say is that, we're able to kind of reach a middle ground, which is often not the case, because I was recently doing this session for the NYU AD Institute, and it was kind of on diasporic voices. And I started realizing that when you're writing as an immigrant, to kind of now take the conversation a little bit, I'm digressing a little bit, but, you realize how many hoops you have to pass to really be able to say, am I entitled to write about this, And so what really speaks to me amongst everything you've said is the fact that there is a way of doing it, yet which is not insensitive to what's happening. And, it takes me back to our own novels, parts of the worlds of those novels are at departures from our own, in many ways. And you're so right, because every time I think about Hira Mandi, I think about, the red light area that I've written about, or you probably think about the world that you've crafted. And people say, what was the research? And I'm like, well, I maybe didn't know that at the time that was going to feed into a fiction novel, but it's definitely those days and nights in Lahore, right? And on those streets, and going in with a very voyeuristic lens, but then over time realizing you can't dumb down the other, as you say, or whatever you want to call it. So I love the fact that there is a way of doing it, because a lot of times the pushback is so extreme that there's a sense of, expats are always writing with this rose-colored lens. At which point, though, I kind of said, Skyfall's way darker than it is. It makes that movement, but please, I can't be accused of that.
No, I mean, I think I often find it like, I mean, where this might be going a chance, but I find it obnoxious when people say the real Pakistan or the real something or the other. And I'm like, everyone has a very different experience of this place, like just based on the layers of identity that you have. And so the poverty you will see is not any more real than the sort of elite parties, whatever, or the like nothing. It's all there, and all the contradictions and the extremes are all sort of parts of the real identity, right? And even people who've made change within the country are, are sort of expats or not expats, but people who've come in and out and sort of and could easily be accused in a world today of being not so real, and so I hear you is what I'm saying. I agree with you.
No, but I love, like we've spoken about this earlier, but my off late favorite word or idea has kind of become, chaos. And the fact that, of course it makes you nervous and it's scary, but when I think of Pakistan, that's or so many other places, I think it's important to be aware. And I absolutely love what you said. Usman, I'm going to move us a little bit towards technology, and I've been thinking a lot about this as well. This idea of, when we think about technology, it's a bit of a double-edged sword is how I see it vis-a-vis the girl child, and vis-a-vis gender equality and things like that. So on the one hand, of course, it's opened up, like digital penetration, for whatever it's worth, even in places like Pakistan today, is allowing access for women and girls, say, from a world or a neighborhood very different from yours and mine, to also be able to tap into worlds and windows that maybe were prohibitive in the past, or at least were not accessible in the past. So that's in some ways, I suppose, aspirationally the good news. But on the other hand, I also feel like it can become a real tool for, I don't know, it can become threatening. And what I mean with that is there is a certain danger to this going viral or virality kind of stream that's become the new mantra, And I suppose I'm curious to hear from you how you think technology features in, if at all, and where you think we're going to go from here in the context of feminism, in the context of the gender movement.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you've sort of hidden it sort of very clearly, right? It's a tool like any other tool, and it can be used for good or ill. But I think it has great potential in terms of because of its pervasiveness and its ability to reach people in areas but what is also likely to happen if steps aren't taken now and resources aren't allocated towards sort of supporting and educating people through it is that you will have not just a huge income gap in some of the places in the world, but huge sort of digital literacy gaps.
Yeah.
And there's a danger, I think, if for marginalized groups or people to become even more marginalized as a consequence of the sort of the growth and use of technology in society. So I think it's not so much that's not to speak ill of technology in general, but just to say that there's there has to be an effort has to be made to sort of make sure that to train sort of future generations with sort of the tools they need to not only be essentially consumers, but producers in digital age. And also for, and that includes, young girls, but also boys and others from poorer rural backgrounds. And so I think that's, and also, one also has to think about these, when doing these interventions, about really the reality of the situation past all the figures one gets. Because I remember when I in a lot of these, working a lot of these sort of initiatives to engage with people in rural areas, although the person or signatory for, say, a microloan might be a woman, oftentimes a man would come and sit with them and sort of say everything and take the loan, right? Or a woman might have a cell phone under her name, which you'll call it up and you will see it's actually the man who's taken out the cell phone, for her. Yeah. So I think it's important to sort of look past some of the data as well sometimes, or to try to get a more accurate sense. But fundamentally, I think it's huge potential, huge opportunity. But we have to be very careful and very deliberate in making sure that we don't leave women behind, or we don't leave sort of marginalized groups behind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Usman, I'm on to my final question.
Over perhaps, but
yeah, no, but this has been really, really generative and really great. I want to end with asking you, I want to bring it back a little bit, tying the political to the personal in a sense. And I love the fact that you've done that through this conversation, whether it was talking about your dad or whether you identify as a feminist. And let's wrap with that, Usman. I want to ask you to talk to us a little bit about, you mentioned your mother briefly as being, strong and kind of offering you that role modeling, and I think you put it so beautifully that it made you realize that there is nothing that women can't do, which men can do, which is such a lovely thought. And I feel like I wish more people had that. Who were the role models, or who are the role models for you as we speak, but also growing up? And these could be, I would love to hear from your personal life, but feel free to kind of pop in a fictional reference if that's close to your heart, whatever. But really, like when we think about female role modeling, who springs to mind?
Well, it's so I think I touched on that. Obviously, personally, I think there's the women that I sort of grew up with, and my mother, my sister, all that comes to mind. But in terms of, if we look at the world today, in terms of just other leaders, I guess. Every field you go to, I could name, a number of women who are sort of. I guess there's. I'm going to take a second, just before I sort of muddle through an answer, and just pause.
Please. And I've done that so many times, so feel free to just take a moment. And if you also feel like you want to ditch the question, that's okay too.
Yeah. So, I guess my feeling was a bit that I've touched a bit on this already. So I'm not sure the new one that I'm thinking, but I'm thinking also the question is so broad. Like I'm thinking, I go Angela Merkel and
Yes.
Margaret Atwood and Benedict Evaristo and even Sairuni, or I could also go in Pakistan, all these publishers of female books to you sitting right here, right? There's so many.
That's it. That's where the answer needs to stop, and we can.
Right. To my spouse, who's like a brilliant journalist, but I feel so. There's a lot of. I
love what you said, Usman, because I love what you said, and I think that's the answer right there, because there is no reason for us to try and pigeonhole this into saying, oh, well, of course, a German leader will be operating at maybe a different level. But I think what's very urgent about what you've said is that these things, the range of women that you've mentioned, captures the issue at both its structural challenges, but also at the challenge of our everyday, and kind of, I hate this micro macro terminology, but that's exactly what it is, right? To say that some things will start from within my home, but often it's a consequence of what's happening around and that whole thing. So, I mean, I think everybody you've named, and I'm sure that list is not exhaustive, but it really kind of gives us a snapshot of how heterogeneous, but also how heterogeneous it is, but all of the fact that each of these are urgent and significant in their own way. And let me just add the caveat that I didn't mean to hijack your answer, but I loved what you said.
I'm glad you gave it some form of structure, because I just felt like I felt like I'd keep going, and I was just sort of like, well, I don't know where to start or to end.
No, but I'm also like, isn't it beautiful that sometimes, like, and you and I have no pretensions whatsoever about making this like the pitch perfect conversation on allyship, but I love the fact that we're able to come to this as we think and speak.
I suppose so. And also, I mean, it's what, 50 minutes into the conversation, no one is going to actually sit through this.
Okay. Yes, you're absolutely.
We will see how much they edit out.
That's right. That's right. At this point, we could literally be doing a jig dance and nobody would care. All I can say is Sabine better know where to edit this, because if this little vignette comes in, it's definitely going to give us more likes, but I'm not sure that's...
We should do like this thing so she knows that it's happening. Right. It's like a moment to... Oh, actually, I can do a... Yeah, like
that's great. Yeah, that's a beautiful cover. Yeah. But Osman, what fun would it be if we actually had this as part of it? I'm telling you, the dangers to virality, if you will.
Oh yeah, you can do a watch till the end.
I absolutely love that. Okay, all right. Okay, so where were we? Okay, Osman, so I'm going to end with, we've spoken about role models that come to mind. I wonder if you're open to maybe sharing with us a little excerpt or just a little passage from, it could be something you've written, it could be something you've read, I have no idea, but just anything that springs to mind around this conversation and that speaks to you and that's moved you.
Yeah, so Saba, I appreciate the offer, but I think it would be the height of hypocrisy for me to come on, Girl Summit, to talk about allyship, and for me to then decide to read out something of my own. So I think what makes a lot more sense is for you to take something and really, from your book, Skyfall, and I think share it with all of us that demonstrates it, because, the whole point of allyship is to sort of give space to others. So yeah, I'm gonna and dodge that question.
If you hadn't given me such a compelling reason for it, I would have thought it's a cop-out. But this sounds a bit strange, Osman, but through this session, but even whenever we've spoken before, I just can't take for granted the fact that you seem very intentional about a lot of these issues. And that's definitely, at least in my experience, the exception rather than the rule. And it really gives me hope, because we're always quick to criticize and jump and say, oh, men aren't doing enough. And yes, they aren't doing enough. And that's kind of a reality. But thank you for thinking that through so much beyond the cop out and dodge. And, I'm going to try and see if I can. I also feel a bit pompous coming on this and now like doing a quick plug in for Skyfall. But, there is a part that I read out at the Pakistan launch, which comes to my mind because I think it speaks to this conversation. But last chance, you're absolutely sure you'd rather I do this?
No, I think I would not feel comfortable taking this space at this point.
Yeah. No, I love that about just the way your mind works. Osman, I'm going to read something from, I can't remember what chapter it is. But anyway, I'm going to read it because with fiction, I hate kind of prepping people up and saying, now, let me tell you how to think about what I wrote. And I'm sure you're with me on this. But this is inside the FBI interrogation office, just for context of people who may not have read it. And it's basically where the officers interrogating Rania about this case. So it goes something like, but it isn't what he hoped for. There are no gory, scandalous anecdotes, and it irks him. In his frustration, he decides to probe more brutally. But I've seen my sister butchered, hanging from a pole, and seen my mother and sister navigate the sex trade. I've shaken myself in front of a room full of hawkers, and my body has been thrown into mid-air. I'm no stranger to bullies, and if there is one lesson that the Mohalla taught me, it is to never beg for a bully's kindness. How were you allowed to come to America so far away, all by yourself? Allowed, I repeat. I didn't seek permission from anyone before coming. I want to tell the man to not judge a South Asian woman's mind by her brown skin. A mind is just a mind, be it fair or dark, resilient or vulnerable, spirited or lifeless. And some brown women have beautiful minds which aren't limited to small talk. These brown women talk of how the world is bruised and bleeding, about failures, about dreams and what keeps them up at night, of the possibilities of outstripping reality, and of miracles to heal civilizations. They speak who write and fight every day. I want to say something about how feminism too is versatile and kaleidoscopic, and that bra-burning slogans with tongue-in-cheek placards hoisted by white women is only one of its manifestations. Yeah.
No, thank you. I always love how your prose always veers almost to poetry. Like there's always it's always vivid and sort of visceral in a pretty profound way. So thank you for sharing that. And I think also what a brilliant passage for the topic we're talking about today, right?
Yeah, no, thank you, Usman. You know, I mean, not to make this conversation about myself, but you as an author, but even a consumer knows what that means when someone says like it's your prose is like poetry. So thank you. And yeah, I mean, as you said it, I was thinking, I read this piece out, I can't remember, somewhere else, but it always springs to my mind when I'm thinking about women's issues. So thank you for giving me that space. But also, Usman, thank you so much for being on this conversation today. You know, I don't want to press the point about the gratitude too much because I know you're someone who feels like this must be done. And it's not like, oh, this is a favor you've done, but yet it's not something we can just assume every man will do. And it makes me see the glass half full, which is how Abu always used to recommend we look at the world. And I'm filled with so much gratitude that you were here today. And it means a lot to me because we've had previous conversations, but it's always very, very special to be speaking to you.
Thank you, Saba. It's always a delight talking to you. I feel like I always come away learning something more, and sort of it really is great to sort of think about these issues in a deeper way and really unpack them together. So thank you for being an incisive interview as always, and for really, I think, bringing to light these issues. And again, I think, I appreciate the opportunity to be able to be part of the conversation. But I think, again, I'm just happy to be used. I think it's important. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Usman. Thank you.